You can only really leverage MTA for making decisions if you are doing some type of rule-based attribution. Maybe you have a "how did you hear about us" survey, and then you use that data as an alternative data source to also include that in your MTA. Or I've also heard of trying to estimate clicks based on other data and then put that in the MTA model. But just looking at the clicks, it's going to give you this false confidence that you have an overview of the customer journey.
What's up, everyone? Today we have the pleasure of sitting down with Barbara Galiza. Barbara was an early employee at Her, a YC-backed startup, and became the biggest platform for LGBTQ women, where she would eventually become head of growth. She was also head of growth at different startups like Parity and Home Run, and she worked at an agency where she led data and analytics for Microsoft EMEA. Then she went out on her own as a GTM and analytics consultant for various companies like Gitpod, WeTransfer, Sidekick, and DBT Labs. She also has a newsletter on marketing data called 021 Newsletter. She produces content for data brands like DBT, Mixpanel, and Amplitude, and she has a lot of case studies and webinars that she does for them. So super excited to chat with you today, Barbara. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Very excited about this.
I've been down the multi-touch attribution versus incrementality conversation with a lot of guests on the show in the last 2 months or whatever. So I hope that regular listeners aren't annoyed by this topic, but it's definitely been this point of interest for me. My last company had a ton of internal debates about this, and I think we definitely could have leveraged an external consultant's perspective on this, because a lot of the conversations I've had have been from the vendor side, and I'm really curious to get your kind of unbiased, unattached to a solution take on some of these things. But maybe before we get super deep into that, I love asking this kind of data literacy, data skills question. You're really well positioned to give advice on how does someone get to Barbara's stage in 3, 4, 5 years. Let's say someone's a couple years into their marketing career, they come to Barbara and they're just I don't think that I'm quite there on the data, the analytics side. What do I need to do today to get much better when it comes to data literacy for leading my team, or just becoming better at marketing? What's your advice there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for anyone that really wants to understand marketing better or leverage data better for marketing, I think SQL is a great place to start. I think even, with language learning models, even with all these tools that, have these nice UIs where you can drag and drop, I think knowing SQL really helps you understand how data is structured and how you can join different data sets, how you can group. So I think if you're trying to get on that data ladder and get better at it, just try to start using SQL for some small use cases. I would say you probably don't need to go out and do a course, but almost every company nowadays, has some marketing data in a structured warehouse that you can query. Maybe it's your Amplitude events that are being stored on a data warehouse. Maybe it's Google Analytics, that's some BigQuery. You can start to create some reports and then get better with time. And apart from that, and I think we'll cover this a lot as we talk about attribution, but understanding how the numbers you're measuring are measured is super important. When you're looking at, reporting on Meta, reporting on Google Ads, reporting on Google Analytics, understanding why certain campaigns are getting the credits and why certain campaigns are not, is, if you understand that, I would say you're already in the top 10 percentile in terms of data-driven marketers.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite newsletters where you unpack why certain numbers are different across platforms, because they are measured differently. And so the expectation is that it is different. And so, when you're looking at a report in your marketing automation platform, and a report in GA, and a report in Mixpanel, all of these tools are using different methodologies to measure. And the expectation is that they won't match one to one.
Mm.
you need to decide when you say web visits or when you say
Mhm.
conversions, you need to pick and make it obvious what that definition is and make sure that the tool you're using to measure that number matches your definition that you're kind of picking. But yeah, it's really good advice. I love the advice about understanding more about how data is structured and where you're joining stuff. I think a lot of
Mhm.
companies are becoming more warehouse centric, and marketers maybe don't have full access to data warehouses,
Yeah.
but Census sponsored the show. They have access to starting to build segments and understand more what data they have access to that they maybe don't have in some of these tools. So yeah, I think it's great advice. Those skills aren't gonna die anytime soon. Even though LLMs like ChatGPT definitely make it easier for folks
Yeah.
to like understand stuff. Like I like taking a piece of code and pasting it in ChatGPT and being like, "What's going on here exactly? Like, why doesn't this query work?" And so that's a great way to learn too. But yeah, I really appreciate the tips there. Let's dive into attribution. So just for the folks, we're going to be doing kind of a roundup episode featuring different takes and perspectives on multi-touch attribution and incrementality and MMM. And I've had a lot of folks on the vendor side give us their take about some of these topics. So I'm curious to read out like some of the summary of answers and just get you to give your perspective on some of that stuff. And maybe we can start with attribution, MTA specifically. Lots of folks on this show so far have claimed that attribution is like misunderstood as a direct cause and effect in marketing. For example, if someone clicks on a Google ad and then converts, a lot of MTA tools, especially tools that leverage last touch, will give a lot of credit to SEM or that Google
Mhm.
ad. But they don't necessarily reveal what prompted the search in the first place. Maybe I heard about it on a podcast, or maybe it was a dark social, like a Slack
Mhm.
community recommendation. We don't really know what caused that person to Google something and then click on the Google ad. Do you agree that MTA isn't made for cause and effect and is more of like a behavioral analytics, which tracks actions without proving one caused the other? What's your take there?
I feel like I would even take a little step back
Okay.
and I would start with how are we defining attribution? Because it feels like what you're saying, what a lot of people are saying is when they're thinking about attribution, they're thinking about click based, touch based models.
Hmm.
And to me, attribution is a lot bigger than that.
Okay.
And MTA and click based, touch models is one way that you can attribute. To me, attribution is about understanding the results of campaigns.
Okay.
And that's how I would put it. And there's, multiple ways that you can understand those results. And we will cover, like holdout test, incrementality, MMM, all of that. And click-based, touch-based, MTA is a little part of that.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
not the whole picture. And I would say that, yeah, I agree. I don't think it's necessarily about like MTA. It's about cause and effect. I'm currently, I'm working on an attribution course that is actually going to, well, I think it will be happening by the time
Nice.
the podcast is
Okay,
live.
cool. We'll
And
make sure to link that out.
yeah, so the first cohort is already full,
Okay,
but people can then, join the second cohort. But I'm organizing the attribution course with a team with a data engineer called
cool.
Timo de Chow. And one of the conversations we've been having a lot is what is the role of MTA in 2024 and 2025? Like, what can it actually help you uncover? And the reality is, like MTA, just with clicks, just with tags, like the MTA you see on Google Analytics or you see on your event analytics tool is really only good for measuring a certain type of campaign. So that's why you were saying, attribution tends to maybe overcredit search marketing.
Hmm.
That's because MTA is at the end really good at measuring search marketing. And that's pretty much it by itself. Because MTA only works if there is a click and within, a short window after that click, there is a conversion.
Right.
So when you're thinking about, okay, what kind of campaigns are at the last stage of the funnel? So our bottom funnel campaigns with people with high intent. and need a click in order to work. And when you put it like that, to see like, okay, it's search.
Mm-hmm.
Because, if you do like a video that doesn't generate clicks, if you do display, again, most people don't click. They've done analysis and there's almost no correlation between CTR and sales for social and for display. So when you're looking at click base, you're pretty looking at a good way to measure search and not anything else.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I like how you've taken a step back here, and like attribution is not equal to multi-touch attribution. Multi-touch attribution, aka click-based attribution, is only one little thing in a bunch of different methodologies that fall under the attribution umbrella. What do you think is the difference between this umbrella of like attribution and measurement? Like, are they the same thing? Like, if we say incrementality and MTA are methodologies to measure the effectiveness of your campaigns, is that like the same thing as saying like they're attribution methodologies? Like, what's the difference for you?
Yeah, I would say that's the same.
Okay.
I guess when I think of the word measurement, I think of perhaps, other insights. They're not necessarily just related to understanding the results of campaigns.
Okay.
So I would also put, maybe I want to understand which messaging is performing the best with my audience. And then I would put that under the measurement umbrella, not under the attribution umbrella. But I would say attribution is the act, the science of measuring, business results from your marketing campaigns. And that can be lead, revenue, sales. It can be whatever metric you're using to move the business.
Gotcha. Super helpful. Let's talk about one of the ways that click-based multi-touch attribution is useful. Like, one of the ways MTA has been described by another guest is a tool for distributing credit across different touch points, not determining causality. It helps understand customer engagement, and you can assess whether channels like OTT or CTV are contributing to conversions, but not necessarily proving direct cause. What do you think about MTA as a credit distribution mechanism? Do you agree?
I don't think it's a very effective credit distribution because, like I said, it can only include a touch point when there's a click to it.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, the view that you're going to have is going to be a view for only the strategies that generate clicks. So it's not really going to tell you, what was the role of, even like CTV, the role of social, what was the role of these other touch points before. Something that, we've been talking about also, like in this course, is that I think nowadays you can only really leverage MTA for making decisions if you are doing some type of rule-based attribution. So let's say in that case, maybe you have a how did you hear about us survey that you ask customers when they make a purchase. And then you use that data as an alternative data source to also include that in your MTA. Or I've also heard of, of data agencies that have been trying to estimate clicks based on other data and then put that in their MTA model. But just looking at the clicks, it's going to give you this false confidence that you have an overview of the customer journey when you don't.
Do you think there's a way to make up for that somehow? Like, Rockerbox has built this, like they don't claim to solve like the third party thing. Like, it's well documented that MTA's reliance on third party cookies is flawed for sure, and they don't apply to offline channels like TV or direct mail. But some vendors like Rockerbox claim that modern MTA uses first party data, probabilistic methods, and partnerships with platforms to access deterministic data. So for these offline channels that don't have clicks, like you just mentioned, like we have models, we have surveys to connect that data to measure performance still in some way. And the focus is on using granular data or modeling depending on the channel. Like, what do you think about that?
I think it's possible. I don't know necessarily what's a good way to validate that data and how to keep on improving. But I think, there's a lot of different data sets that you can use to estimate if there was a causality to the action. So, like, for example, like, MMM will look at, the impressions they have generated from a channel on a daily level. And then it will look at the sales results on a daily level. And then based on that, it will use a causal interference, like a Bayesian model to understand if there was an impact. So you would be able to take that methodology, but then instead of trying to correlate to direct sales, you can try to correlate it to clicks and then have like a synthetic click that shows in your MTA model. But I think this is where we're moving towards. But I think that we're still really trying to figure out what's the best way forward. With the course, we've been having a lot of conversations about how these things have changed. And I think, like back then, even like way before, like these privacy changes and the appreciation of cookies, I think MTAs worked better because you had companies that were, mainly relying on one form of advertising.
Right.
You had companies that were running, mostly on paid search. And if that's the case, then indeed, like MTA works. But nowadays, at least, every client that I work with is running, a combination of channels and strategies. And MTA was never really a fit of that. Even if you still had, like third-party cookies, even if you still had, no GDPR, all of that, MTA would still have all these gaps that you cannot really use to understand the user journey across all of these different types of marketing strategies.
Yeah.
What I always try to do when I'm talking about attribution, I always like to look at attribution from a strategy perspective. So I'm not, I'm not going to a client and I'm going like, this is how you need to attribute. I'm looking at, okay, you're doing Meta. How do we attribute Meta? You're doing alongside Meta, you're doing podcast sponsors. How do we attribute that? Really try to separate because each type of attribution is the best fit for a certain type of marketing strategy. So that's why you can't really answer these holistic macro questions with just one data source.
Very cool. I like the strategic channel-based approach to attribution there. So what is MTA really good at aside from like click-centric channel-based things like Meta and Google? Like, do you think that there is something to this idea that MTA is really good at the path to conversion, like showing you the paths of new versus returning customers? Obviously, only limiting that to online touches, but is it good at like how channels are impact conversion speed, or like you kind of answered this one already, like overall marketing effectiveness? Like, does this idea of path to conversion kind of jam with you a little bit with MTA or no?
I think even social, MTA is not particularly good at. Because, when you're looking at social, especially nowadays, most clicks happen on mobile. So even if you're, I had a client just now, they're a DTC brand. They get a lot of mobile conversions. And then they want to use like, UTMs to measure, Meta ads. But what I told them is like, it doesn't really work. Because when someone clicks on an ad on the Facebook app, Google Analytics or whatever tool you're using to use this is going to understand that as a different user, as the user that goes on to open Safari on their phones and makes the purchase. So unless they're literally clicking on the Facebook ads or the Instagram ads and making the purchase like within that session without ever leaving their Facebook and Instagram app, a click-based UTM model is not going to capture it.
Yeah, and that's not even capturing people that are using cross devices. Like we'll go on
it's
their
the same
desktop.
device, literally the same device, but it still can't capture.
Yeah.
So the gaps are just so wide that you're going to be looking at this data and you're going to go like, yeah, but is that really the case? No, like
Right.
I've had also like a client where we use Snowplow, and then we invested a lot in MTA. And then we were, what it told us, and we could have like different attribution models, was that most people that were searching for the brand name on the paid search were converting within the first session. Like that was their first visit. Obviously, that's not the case. Because, like if you're searching for the brand name, like I'm going to guess that you've gotten some other advertising from us before.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also converting and purchasing within the first visit. Like that's all can be true, right? So you have to take all of this data, with a grain of salt. And it's our job as marketers to go like, that doesn't seem like it's really it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe we can talk about like what are some of the alternatives that you kind of work with clients on, not that like MTA in and of itself for the click-based stuff, like there maybe is some value, but only when you're combining it with some of these other methodologies. So one of the ones that's been painted as the golden alternative to MTA is incrementality. And so it's been defined as measuring sales that wouldn't have happened without marketing efforts. It's like getting a baseline to avoid attributing everything to a certain channel or like marketing, right? And the focus should be on understanding the marginal return of the last dollar spent. And like while methodologies like MTA, and we'll talk about MMM in a second, like they all have pros and cons, the key is to start with the right question, not the methodology itself. So incrementality has a bunch of testing involved, right? And we can unpack some of this stuff like geo-based testing, holdouts. They can all complement MTA reporting, helping marketers optimize spend based on like real data rather than relying on models or assumptions. What do you think about incrementality? Like, is it like being put too much on a pedestal? Like, do you agree that it's really the golden alternative to MTA?
I think, what we're going to unpack in this conversation is that there is no golden alternative.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of solutions. Some solutions work well for certain strategies, and all of solutions have different gaps. I actually really like incrementality. I always try to tell clients to, have a testing roadmap where you are always running incremental tests. But that's very difficult, isn't it? A lot of the times, marketing teams have targets, leadership wants campaigns to run. Incrementality sometimes means like, actually having a cut of your revenue if you stop something that was working. Not all strategies can be run incremental. Like if I'm trying to assess, what brings me leads, I can't make this podcast an incremental strategy. Say it, hey Phil, please only put this, in these on these locations so I can analyze the impact. Some marketing campaigns are very long term, so you're not going to get the insights there. Some marketing campaigns have small returns, so even picking a geo can be difficult. There's all of these scenarios where incrementality doesn't work amazingly. But I think, if you're running social, if you're running display, and if you're running that, in let's say like a 6-figure budget on a monthly basis, then I think you should definitely try to have incremental tests in your testing roadmap. But that requires dedication from the marketing team and support from the data team to help them analyze, find the MTAs that they should be running in, all of these different things that sometimes teams don't have the resources to do.
Yeah, definitely. Even startup teams. Like I had a conversation earlier in the year with one of the guys who leads growth at Notion, and he was working at Spotify before that, and they had all of these like growth pods within a massive like enterprise at Spotify, right? But there was like all these different like cross departmental pods essentially, and like a designer with a marketer and a data
Yeah.
engineer and then a data scientist. They're all coming up with like experiments to drive a certain KPI or a certain area of the funnel. But in like your average company, your average startup, like marketers just have a ton on their plate, and coming up with a testing and experimentation roadmap, as amazing as it sounds, like there's a lot of other stuff that takes priority over testing every single thing to get a like this incremental causal confidence that this thing that we're doing is leading to revenue. So yeah, it's a tricky thing for sure.
It's always a balance, right? Are you better? I mean, you should always try to invest to understand what has worked. But there's also situations where you're better off just keep doing it
Hmm.
than trying to measure. And all of these things you need to put it on a balance, understand what's the impact, what's the cost, and try to do the best you can.
Yeah, I've actually chatted with folks at companies like Ahrefs and Wistia that aren't like fully allergic to measurement and
Mhm.
attribution, but like they really don't focus on it. It's not anywhere near the top of their list of priorities. Ahrefs doesn't even use Google Analytics to measure anything. Like the only real numbers they look at is revenue. And if
Yeah.
revenue is going up and it's green, they're doing something well. Like it was with the Samo, who's leading content there. So he's really big on YouTube, and he was looking at a lot of like sentiment analysis and
Hmm.
like comments in YouTube and really optimizing like the videos. But he
Hmm.
was like, am I measuring how many views are leading to conversions and none of that stuff? Like
Yeah.
he's looking at revenue, and like Tim Sulu, their CMO, is just like really big on that idea also. But I think that's like putting it a step, like, more extreme than what you're kind of advocating.
Yeah.
Like, there should still be some measurement, especially if you're, like, trying new ideas and you don't really have a good grasp of, like, what
Hmm.
is leading to revenue, and maybe you're not as grown as fast as Ahrefs and Wistia, but there
Yeah.
still should be some measurement in your opinion, right?
And and you need to be able to grow with confidence, right?
Right.
There reaches a point in a company's life, be it because they've gone public, be it because of pressure of the board, that they're gonna want to know, like, what does the marketing budget need to be for
Right.
us to grow 15% next quarter? And if you don't know where your results are coming from, you're not gonna be able to answer that question.
Mhm. Yeah, especially when we're like, we want to like 2x or 5x
Yeah.
revenue. And then they're asking the CMO or the marketing leader, what are like the three things that led to the most
Mm,
revenue? Can we just like hire 10 more people and just like
exactly.
do a ton more of that
Mhm.
stuff? The thing that's different with like the Wistias and the Ahrefs of the world is that they're not trying to like 10x the size of the company to
Mhm.
become like a $1 billion unicorn. Like they're happy with the size that they're at right now, with the profitability that they're at. So like not every company is trying to 10x and has like this big
Yeah.
board of VCs that are like pushing for that like crazy growth. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's a different balance
Yeah.
everywhere. But I wanted to ask you, so MMM, incrementality, MTA, like we talked about, there's different areas where each of those methodologies shine. And maybe we can chat about like what all three methods are useful for, but where they focus, where they differ in their focus areas. So this is kind of the summary of the takes from different folks on the show, and I'm curious if you agree. So we can unpack them one by one, but I'll just like I'll read it out for you for all three. MTA offers path to conversion insights, better seen as behavioral analytics that optimize bottom of the funnel conversion journeys. MMM requires at least 2 years of data and 5 million annual spend. It helps with high level budgeting, but not daily optimization. It offers correlation insights, showing which channels are linked to business outcomes, but doesn't prove causality. Incrementality testing, while it has some of its downfalls and potential costs related to it by turning stuff off, it helps determine causality. It shows the last dollar spent is impactful, but, point in time results do have their challenges there. Do you agree with those three? Like, is there one that you want to double down on? Like, curious your take.
I think roughly I all agree with them. I don't know exactly how much budget is required for MMM to make sense. But I agree there is a significant budget threshold.
Yeah.
Because it is, a casual interference analysis in the end. So you need to have, enough data to be able to make this correlation analysis work. And I think, like I've said, on MTA, yes, bottom funnel, but also important to mention that there needs to be clicks there, because perhaps you're doing some bottom funnel activities that don't have clicks, like, I don't know, case studies, for example. It's a bottom funnel activity. And indeed, and it doesn't mean that they're not important, but they're not going to show it's like in an MTA model. And the other one was the one incrementality. Yes, yeah. And I would also add there's also the length that it's important there too. How long does it take for the conversion to occur? But that's usually for when people are doing like an incrementality analysis. They will also want to pick an event that's a bit more higher occurrence. So maybe you're not looking at sales, maybe you're looking at leads or white paper downloads. A lot of these things are easier for B2C because there's just so much more data.
Yeah. For startups and measurements, like obviously many startups end up failing because they're testing way too many channels and they're trying to do too much stuff early on, and they're expecting a measurement company to fix like lack of results based on like when they're bringing this person or this vendor in. But measurement is like a scale. It only focus and reflects on like what's working in a sense. Like once you have a profitable, scalable channel, then you can consider adding measurement to enhance growth. Do you agree that like that's the typical approach or recommendation for startups, that like they really shouldn't focus on attribution, let alone engage with measurement companies when they're too early on in that journey, and instead they should rely on intuition to grow revenue and focus on a couple of key channels? And once they're scaling, then they can use geo-based experimentation marketing efforts? Or like, do you think that they should focus on finding just one channel? Just like curious your take on like what should startups be doing that like they don't have a data scientist team, maybe they don't have the resources to hire a vendor or like a measurement expert like you. What advice would you have for startups?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different questions there. There is, a question on marketing strategies and what should they focus on.
Yeah.
There is a question on measurement. So let me try to like unpack. I guess the first thing that I would say, if you're a startup and you found a channel that is working for you, double down on that. I'm a firm believer that the best marketing strategy is to pour gasoline into the fire.
Very cool.
Whenever like a company, they're like, oh, we want to do paid media, I try to understand how they're growing today and how paid media can help them increase that.
Right.
Not about starting a whole channel, but how can we use paid to improve what's already working? So I would say first things first, you found your channel, squeeze all the juice, because, channels change. Competitors enter the market. There is, privacy changes. So it's not, you shouldn't take it for granted that that channel is always going to be there for you to grow from it. So make sure to, squeeze it all. What I would also say is, and I would say that for startups, but for scale ups too, don't worry too much about like a one source of truth. That is such an oasis, like a myth, a utopia. There's never going to be like a one source of truth where you're going to be able to see all your channels, all your touch points, and be able to, perfectly attribute those results. So don't worry about like an MTA or a unified reporting. Just try to measure the activities that you're doing. And if you're a startup, you don't have the data team resources. If you're B2C, have like a user option on how did they find out about us. And if you're like B2B, ask leads. I always find, good leads questions are, how did you find out about us? And what problem do you think we can help you with? And how do you think we help you solve? Because that kind of tells you you know, one, you know, the attribution, but it also tells you the positioning that is working. So just make sure to, you know, gather that data and store it. And I think if you have these things, you already have a very good intuition, but it's not. It's just qualitative data on what is working and not working. And then you can take it from there.
Yeah. I think it's great advice. I'm curious to ask you on like the self-reported attribution question there. Like it's very polarized. Like some people love it and they put a lot of green and like focus on it. And some people just like shame it and they think that it's completely invalid data because humans aren't perfect. Humans have horrible memory. Humans are irrational, predictably. And if you ask someone a question of like, how did you hear about us? What are the odds that this person remembers that the first actual impression was a display ad on like an unrelated website, or it was a banner they saw when they were driving, and maybe they give credit to something that was like actually in the middle of their journey? Just curious your take there.
Yeah, I think of course, you know, but you can say the same about like customer interviews.
Right.
You know, why am I going to interview customers if they're going to give me this biased view? Obviously, you take everything they say with a heavy grain of salt.
Right.
I would say, you know, it's not necessarily the perfect attribution, but okay, if they remember a certain touch point, that tells you something about that touch point too, right?
Okay. Yeah, that's super interesting. So you mentioned like there is no oasis of like a source of truth for measurement. So let's say like I'm a listener and I'm listening to this conversation, and when I go to these like attribution meetings, we have one person showing this set of data. Yeah. And like this other person on a different team is saying, no, like the credit should be given to this. And like all of these different methodologies, opinions, ideas in that meeting, like how do you make sense of all of that? Like if there isn't an oasis of a source of truth, you said your advice to startups is to just like measure one thing and just kind of go with it. Like how much effort do companies put on figuring out the trust behind the measurement methodology versus just doing the thing and like getting stuff out the door and like driving revenue? Like I've struggled with that like my entire career. I'm curious your advice.
Yeah, they put way too much focus on these things, don't they? I would say, yeah, one of the things that happens a lot is regarding incentives, right? When you have, you know, different teams that want to receive the attribution credit. So they can sometimes, you know, employees even have bonus attached to it. You know, if you bring in, you know, an X number of, you know, conversions and your bonus is X, to me, that's all like a recipe for disaster and for wasting everyone's time on trying to figure these things out.
Yeah, those are never fun conversations, especially like, but they happen less in my career later on, but like early on, it was always like marketing fighting sales. And like, was it marketing that influenced that pipeline number? And anyways, yeah, it's I think like one of the least productive parts of attribution when it comes to just like what team should be getting credit for something. Like we're all part of the same company. We all have the same goal. We're all trying to grow the company. Why are we spending meetings arguing about who drove this and who drove what? So
I mean, there's definitely times that I say that it's better to have no data than data. Because if you don't know how to interpret or how to use it, that's actually more damaging to your company than just going along. I was having a conversation recently with someone from Uber, and they were saying that the way, you know, Uber calculates CAC is they just take all costs and divide by all new accounts. And that's their CAC calculation. And I was like, that is perfect.
Interesting. As long as they're keeping that definition steady over the years. But I'm curious to ask you about testing culture because, like, I think, you know, there's this I forget like who said this, but like there's most tests, like 70 to 80% of tests, probably more, fail to show incremental value because they don't get statistical significance. But that's kind of part of learning, right? Like you're trying something and you're hoping that it leads to something and it doesn't always have detectable effect. But I think most of us understand that testing like should always be linked to specific questions or goals.
Mhm.
And I've asked this to a lot of guests, but like, does everything need to be a test? Is testing culture dependent on this? Like, is qualitative data enough sometimes? Curious your take.
I think it depends. I feel like it depends is just always an answer that
It
comes with
depends,
me.
yeah.
I don't think that you can do attribution without a testing roadmap,
Mm,
because even something like MMM needs to have variations to it in order to calculate casualty. So, that's increasing budget, that is turning off in certain regions, that is very important. I think there's a lot of companies that do tests without a methodology first, and that is, you will be surprised by how common that is. They're like, oh, we're gonna test this. And then later, how do we measure?
mm.
And yeah, that's probably the reason why 80% of tests don't uh,
Mm,
don't drive any results, because they weren't set up with a hypothesis and with a methodology before they start running.
right.
But I think like everything that you do in marketing, in measurement, you only have an X number of hours in a day. So you have to make sure that what you're focusing on is what can actually drive an impact. And indeed, I think, yeah, testing buttons, testing landing page changes, testing yeah, a lot of the times it's people want to postpone decisions, I feel,
Mhm.
or they want to take away that responsibility.
Yeah, settle
And
arguments.
mhm, mhm. And I always also say, like, marketing data, none of it is real. These are all estimates. And we just have to also remember that.
I like that. That might be the teaser for this episode. All marketing data isn't real.
Yeah.
It's all estimates. We
Yeah,
live in
no,
a
it's
simulation
true.
of marketing data.
It's true, because every single metric you look at is not the real number.
Mm,
Users, it's not. It can be devices. It can be multiple users in the same household. Page views, there's bots. There is, cookie blocking. There is there's different consent laws. None of these numbers are real. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, are real or 100% accurate.
Yeah.
Maybe we can. I got a couple last questions for you. So, like, maybe on this topic of like data quality, like, there one guest shared like three components to effective marketing data. Like, before we even get to attribution and measurement analysis, whatever, like, there's foundational data management component to all of this. Like, even though we know like there isn't this perfect like data with marketing, there are some things we can do to at least like get to a number that we're confident with. But I'll give you the list of all three that folks have mentioned are kind of essential for effective marketing data. I'm curious if you'd add anything or if you agree with them. So the first one is ensuring that you're gathering relevant data, like user
Mhm.
interaction with ads. The second is categorizing the data consistently across platforms to avoid misreporting or limit misreporting as much as possible. And the third one is connect that data both within marketing channels and with internal company data using join keys and a bunch of different tooling there. Would you add anything? Curious if you agree.
I think I would add a bunch of things to that.
Okay.
I would add naming conventions.
Mm,
I think, especially when it comes to paid media, there's only so much value you can get based on what's available out of box on ad platform reporting.
mhm.
So all context that is relevant for your product should go in the naming conventions. I would add, and I don't know if that would fall within the scope, but literacy and education.
Mm.
It's not enough to just have the data. You need people to be able to use the data and understand the data. Um, I would add, now I'm just thinking, sorry, Phil, I didn't prepare that much for this question.
All
So I'm
good.
just trying to, but I think that there's all of these, best practices that are ignored. I would add testing roadmaps.
Yeah.
I think, making sure that that's included in your daily plan, and there's a cadence to that is very important. Hypotheses are very important, making sure that you know what you're trying to measure.
Mm.
I think strategy-based attribution, like I said, is also very important. They are not just trying to get this macro view to allocate budget, but they are also really trying to look at each strategy separately and understand what should this strategy in specific measure. Like
Mhm.
a top of funnel campaign is very different from a bottom funnel campaign. So because of that, you need to have a different way of measurement.
Mhm.
And I think these are some that I would add. Accessibility, I would
Mhm.
also add, like what you were saying before, back in the beginning of the conversation, that, there's a lot of data warehouses, but marketers are excluded from it.
Yeah.
Domain experts need to be able to model, need to be able to transform the data, have access to it instead of have everything be delivered in this dashboard that they go on to download and use Google Sheets.
Yeah, go on to download and not understand behind the
Yeah,
scenes how the data is powered and where it's getting pulled from. No,
indeed.
this is all great, really great advice. I especially like the nomenclature piece, but also the like understanding experimentation design. Like
Mhm.
I feel like a lot of people in marketing are just like, yeah, I'm really good with experimentation, like hypothesis, get it out, like yeah, run it for as long as you need to, like 90% confidence, whatever. But I had a short stint at my only real big company enterprise experience was with automatic WordPress.com, who's taking a
Mhm.
lot of fire right now. I don't know if you're paying
Yeah, I've
attention
been
to
following
this.
that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool being an external person now,
Oh, yeah.
keeping tabs on all that drama. But one thing they did super well at WordPress.com is they had a big team of data, and a lot of internal tooling was built, and we had an internal experimentation platform, and it was cross-channel, and it was run by a team of data scientists and data engineers, and part of their role was just experimentation design literacy within like the
Mm.
entire marketing org. And you couldn't create an experiment in the platform until you had gone through the training on like how to
Mhm.
use the tool, but also what is the minimal detectable effect? What is the length of your experimentation? What is a good hypothesis? Like all of those things were just like prerequisites. And I was like one of those marketers, like, yeah, like I'm good with experimentation. When I finished that course and started using the tool, like it was just like opening up to a world where like data scientists were actually doing the teaching for marketers. And yeah, I really like that point of advice there.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think, if I could give one takeaway to companies in this podcast, it would be, try to get your data and your marketing teams to work a bit closer together, because they both need each other. Data teams are struggling to show the business value they provide,
Hmm.
and marketing teams are struggling to make decisions based on data. So they can help each other out a lot.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I think that is maybe one of the ethos of the podcast. Like a lot of the listeners are either on the one end of the spectrum, like they're on data teams, or they're more on the creative side of marketing, but they're coming together in a more like pseudo technical marketing role. Like a lot of folks have called it like a data product manager or Martech product manager who works in between both teams. And
Mhm, mhm.
they're like translating stuff, right? Because like
Yeah.
data engineers don't have time to learn the lifecycle marketing use cases of why we do dunning campaigns and
Mhm.
abandoned cart campaigns. And marketers don't always have the bandwidth to learn everything about experimentation design. And so yeah, like that bridging the gap between the two. It's what makes the show really awesome. And I
Yeah.
think the insights you brought today were super helpful to spur that mission there. So really appreciate your time. I got one last question for you, Barbara. You're an analytics consultant. Obviously, you work with awesome brands. You're also creating a ton of valuable content. You're also a big tennis player. You're a home chef and a foodie. You're also a dog mom. But one question we ask everyone on the show is, how do you remain happy and successful in your career? And how do you find balance between all the things you're working on while staying happy?
It's a great question. I'm very much of a goal-oriented person. I really like to also gamify things.
Hmm.
So I really like targets. And that's probably the lamest answer you've gotten on this podcast.
It makes
But
sense. A measurement expert likes targets.
I adore targets and hitting targets and targets that don't mean anything to anyone else but me. And yeah, I've always, I guess, had a pretty relaxed life. I try to take a lot of time off throughout the week. I went to the market earlier today, to buy some nice food for me, some nice treats. Went to the park with my dog. So I try to not think of work as something that, just needs to go on for the whole day. And I try to work really when I feel like it. I guess
Mhm.
that sounds weird, but
No, it makes sense.
there are times, yeah, that I don't really feel like working, and then
Mhm.
that's fine because that's just life.
Yeah. Yeah. You have your flow state. You're way
Yeah.
more productive sometimes when it's dark outside. You're a bit more of like a nocturnal owl, and I'm definitely like that myself. So, yeah, super good advice there, Barbara. This has been a super fun conversation. There's probably a bunch of other jumping off points. I'll link out to the upcoming course that you're doing for the next cohort. But your newsletter as well, I think a great resource for marketers and data teams as well. So yeah, really appreciate your time, Barbara. It's just super fun.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Phil. This was great.